Muchísimas gracias por invitarme. Quisiera saludarlo y agradecer esta invitación y compartir con vosotros alguna reflexión por empezar esta discusión en estos días, que seguramente va a ser muy intensa y muy útil. Vado a decir alguna palabra en español. Me han pedido de hablar en el idioma con lo cual trabajo, es decir, el inglés o el francés, entonces va a ser el inglés. De otro lado, mi español no es particularmente bueno, es un italiano con acentos diferentes. Mi inglés es un poco más o menos como el español, el francés lo mismo, el italiano es el peor, entonces no había solución alternativa más de concentrarnos en esto. Más que el idioma, cuenta cómo empezar una conferencia. Nosotros en la OCDE trabajamos con muchos países. Eso nos dicen que se trata de empezar la charla de manera diferente a segunda del país en el cual uno está. Con lo cual, si está en los Estados Unidos, debe empezar con un chiste. Mas si está en Japón, debe empezar disculpándose. Ahora, como no estamos en Estados Unidos, en Japón, decidió de disculparme por mi chiste. Simplemente porque no lo tengo, y con lo cual vado inmediatamente a tratar la cuestión. Ahora todos tienen la traducción simultánea, si no yo puedo hacerla solo, hablar en español, en inglés, como quieren. Si hay alguna cosa que no se entiende, por favor que levanten la mano y me lo piden, y yo intento de decirlo en italiano modificado. Muy bien. Es un verdadero honor de estar aquí y de hablar de temas con una perspectiva de largo plazo, una perspectiva que en el centro de la OCDE empezó hace muchos años, en particular gracias a un investigador, Angus Maddison, que decidió de colectar e identificar datos de largo plazo por explicar qué se estaba pasando en la economía mundial en los últimos 300 años. Este esfuerzo fue particularmente útil y nos ha dado muchísimo insumo. Nosotros continuamos en este análisis, en particular, como siempre pasa, mis colaboradores me han dicho que yo debo hacer un poco de publicidad al centro y me han ponido 3 láminas por hacerlo. Yo no vado a introducir este tema. En el centro cada año hacemos 4 informes principales, 3 outlook. Uno se llama el African Economic Outlook, que he tenido el honor de presentar el lunes de la semana pasada en Marrakech, donde se ha tenido la asamblea anual del Banco Africano de Desarrollo, porque lo hacemos con el Banco Africano de Desarrollo, con la Comisión Económica per África de las Naciones Unidas, UNECA, y con el PNUD. Hacemos también el Latin American Economic Outlook, que es un documento oficial de la Cumbre Iberoamericana, que presentamos entonces cada año donde se celebra la cumbre. El año pasado era en Cádiz, este año va a ser en Panamá. Es un documento que hemos empezado solo. Yo decidí hace 2 años que se trataba de hacerlo con una institución latinoamericana y a partir de 2 años lo hacemos junto a la CEPAL. Hacemos también el Southeast Asian Economic Outlook, hace 3 años. Lo hacemos solo por el momento, en muy fuerte cooperación con otra institución asiática, en particular el secretariado del ASEAN y AMRO, que es un consorcio de los países del ASEAN más Corea, China y Japón. Ma el documento en particular que me gustaría comentar aquí es el que nosotros llamamos Perspective on Global Development, que es un documento que producimos cada año. La última versión fue lanzada el 15 de mayo en París y ahora lo estamos difundiendo en diferentes lugares. La cosa importante en verdad del centro no es tanto esta publicidad, cuanto marcar su naturaleza institucional. La OCDE fue creada en el 61 y fue decidido en este momento que se trataba en esta organización de compartir prácticas de política entre los países desarrollados. En alguna medida hay que decir que la D en el nombre, OECD, no estaba tanto por development o desarrollo, cuanto estaba por donors. En alguna medida que los donantes hacen por el desarrollo. Esta solución no le gustó completamente a algunos políticos de la época, en particular a John Fitzgerald Kennedy, que propuso la creación de un centro de desarrollo en lo cual se podían sentar con la misma voz, como full member, países desarrollados y países en desarrollo. Esta es la información que cuenta por entender la lógica en la cual opera mi centro, e en particular que conjuntamente a 24 países de la OCDE, entre otros España, Italia, Alemania, Corea y otros, hay 17 países que soy miembro a título lleno de mi centro, pero no soy miembro de la OCDE. Este países soy, por citar alguno, en Latinoamérica, por ejemplo, Brasil, Argentina, Colombia, Perú, Costa Rica, República Dominicana, ahora Panamá pide entrar, y hay también México y Chile, que soy también miembro de la OCDE. En África, el Egipto, el Marruecos, el Senegal, el Cabo Verde, Mauritius, Sudáfrica, y ahora Tunisia pide entrar, y Togo también. En Asia, India, Indonesia, Tailandia y Vietnam, y ahora Filipinas pide entrar. Entonces, en alguna medida, en mi centro trabajamos con los emergentes y con ellos que ya emergieron, por discutir conjuntamente de práctica de política. No es raro, entonces, comprender por qué hemos elaborado este tipo de informe. En particular, hace 3 años, el primer número que se intituló Shifting Wealth, nombre que ha tomado algún éxito. Y de esto ahora, switchando en inglés, voy a hablar. In particular, I would like to address 3 aspects of this general shifting wealth, with the starting point, the fact that there is a shifting wealth, then to describe the impacts of shifting wealth on the global economy, and finally, is it shifting wealth sustainable? Are we going to continue in the same direction, or there are emerging questions that ask for answers? Now, let me start with the first point. The first point starts in reality with a little story. One day I was in my office, and there is a colleague of mine, a German guy, that comes in the office and says, Mario, we have seen that Wolfenstein, at that moment was the president of the World Bank, suggested a typology for countries. And in particular, he suggested that there is a type of country, the converging, that are countries that were capable to have a rate of growth more than the double of the OECD average rate of growth. And he said, tell me, Mario, how many countries in the 90s were capable to have a rate of growth more than the double of the OECD? I didn't know. I don't like this type of games. And so I said, tell me. And he said, 13. In fact, these are the countries. They are in red. You see there is China, there is Chile, there are other countries, maybe a little bit more difficult to identify, Vietnam and others. So I said, fine, that's very interesting, but so what? And he said, tell me now how many countries had that characteristics in the first 10 years of this millennium, 2000, 2010. They were 13 in the 90s. How many in the 2000? I have to confess I didn't have an answer, so he showed me these slides. I prefer to go back and forward because in itself I think is very significant. This is not the dissemination of communism. I know that many of you would prefer that type of configuration, but this is another type of indicators. Is how many countries had a speed that was absolutely incomparable with those of the developed countries. 83 countries represent a change in the whole geography of the world. It was recalled before with the expression, the center of gravity of the globe is moving. In fact, there is an economist in Oxford or in Cambridge, I don't remember, that is doing this exercise. And he calculated that in the 90s and 40 years ago, more or less the center of gravity of the global economy was in the Azores Islands, which is not surprising because North Atlantic was the economic area that was driving. Now, the same exercise identifies the center of the economy more or less on the eastern border of Turkey, and is still moving. Moving east, if we look things from here, that's our east, it's not necessarily China east. So is this east and is moving south. Now, this phenomenon in itself created a strong discussion. We decided to have a report and to disseminate to my colleague in the different directorates of the OECD. And the reaction was very simple. They said, it's not true. It's not true. Yes, there is a different rate of growth. It's a phenomena, but it's not a shift in wealth. It's just the fact that certain countries have a different speed on growth, and as such, they are catching up. They are converging, as Wolfenstein was saying, but they are not necessarily we studied carefully the point in which we observe these graphs. And here you see, in one hand, the rate of growth of OECD countries, which is declining, and then you see the rate of growth of the middle-income economies that is growing. Now, what matters here is not the fact that one is growing and the other is declining, it's the length of time that entails this change. If you have different speed of growth for some years, that's fine. But if you have a phenomenon which is continuous over time, this means accumulation of international reserves, means accumulation of investment, at the end means accumulation of wealth. And there is a change, a structural change, under our point of view, that is taking place in the global economy. Now, why this took place now and not before? In other historical phases, we have been confronted with the new industrialized countries, with countries that were originally poor, very poor, with level of GDP per capita lower than Latin American countries. I remember that Gunnar Myrdal, Nobel Prize of Economics, used to think that the continent of the future was Latin America. There was no hope for Asia. Unfortunately, it was not the right story. And still, these countries, the new industrialized countries, were capable to grow very quickly. Despite their growth, the global economy didn't suffer any major change. Why now a change? We are in completely different situation. The new industrialized countries were a small group of countries, small by size, which means that as traditionally it happened with economic development, you have the economic development taking place, therefore movement of population from rural areas to urban areas, the return on profits on investment goes up, the profits, the wages don't move because there is a strong supply of labor that keep the wages low. But what happened in Chinese Taipei, in South Korea, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, was that given the size of those countries, after a few years of development, wages start increasing at the same time that return from investment. Why? Because in those economies, full employment was quickly reached. What we are observing now is a situation in which countries such as China, India, in part Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia in particular, are countries where the supply of labor in rural areas is indefinite and will continue to exist for a long period of time unless there is segmentation on the labor market. As a consequence, the pressure on wages is going to continue, and despite there is increasing productivity, wages will not move. So we are confronted for many years to a general change in the economy, which is, among other things, the injection into the economy of barely 1.5 billion new workers, blue collars, in the labor market of the globe. And this is changing the condition. The second different things from the past was that this large country exists also in Africa, things Nigeria, for example, and in other parts of the globe. Why China, India, Brazil, South Africa are so different in respect to Nigeria? Well, because those countries I'm mentioning, they do have technological capability, which is not the case of Nigeria and other Angola or other countries in Africa. As a consequence, they may have low wages, but at the same time, capacity to produce products that are permanently upgrading and more sophisticated in what they do. This series of phenomena is creating a structural change that we have called shifting wealth. And what I would like to do today is to address some of the impacts of shifting wealth and to comment on also some of the challenges that this phenomena is facing. So I move to my second point, and I will address things that are well known, I mean skills, finance, infrastructure, but just to highlight some interpretation that needs to go with obvious phenomena. The first phenomena is about the so-called middle classes. The economists, many other international organizations, we were among the first in the Development Center speaking about Latin America, but now also the World Bank are speaking about the so-called new middle classes in the economy. What matters about these new middle classes in the economy? Well, mainly the fact that thanks to the development, Brazil, China, and India are increasingly looking to their potential internal demand to design development strategies that may make sustainable their growth. We know the northern part of the Atlantic is reducing the demand in terms of imports and therefore exports for China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa. And these countries are increasingly thinking to change their strategy. The most evident case is China, that is doing it not only because there is a crisis in the northern part of the Atlantic, but also for internal important reason. The fact is that not only China, but also Brazil are progressively thinking to their internal demand. In a certain sense, and in the Cumbre Iberoamericana of Cadiz, for example, this could be a good news for the North Atlantic countries, because we may say, okay, we do not have demand, let's hope that China will buy our product instead. But it's very difficult to hope for that, because we are speaking of countries that are trying carefully to create a trajectory of development after years in which their capacity to organically create development and sustain it was weak. Now there are expectations in these middle classes, and the government are called to provide answers to those expectations more than to provide answers to the expectation of the developed countries that now are in crisis. Nevertheless, these middle classes now represent already an important part of the global demand, and we estimate that in 2030, 80% of the world's middle classes will be living in developing economies. What are we calling middle classes, just for simplification, but I will come back on this point, is people that receive between 10 to 100 US dollars in PPP terms. A second important phenomenon that is happening is a change in trade. Let me give you just some information. In 2009, if we take Africa this time and not Latin America, but the story is similar, in 2009, China passed the United States as a trade operator with Africa. In reality, the most important partner of Africa in trade terms is China. We tend to say that it's European Union. Okay, but that's a bunch of countries. If we speak about countries, China is the first partner of Africa. United States come after that, and then come some European countries. That's crucial, because this didn't happen in the expenses of the other. Africa, in the last 10 years, doubled its trade with the external world, and China was capable to gain an important share of this increase in trade of Africa. But the European countries were capable to maintain their position. The story is that it's not only China. The story is that it's China, India, Turkey, South Korea, Brazil. And what is interesting is that each of those countries are bringing to Africa different types of skills in the trade relationship. We know that China trades mainly in terms of raw material and infrastructure. India is working much more on software and informatics sectors related relations. Brazil is a leader in technology related to agriculture. South Korea and Turkey has opened more than 30 new embassies in Africa in the last years. Turkey and South Korea are operating with Africa in terms of manufacturing. What is interesting in this story is that each one of these countries being potentially capable to bring different skills, there is an emphasis on government in Africa that need to create strategies in order to pick and choose, and by creating an appropriate basket of trade relationship, can design a strategy which is more or less helpful for their future development. Are they doing it? Well, that's an open question. In reality, for many years, we have told those countries that the last thing they had to do is to design strategy. What they had to do is to do certain policy, one after the other, one just opposed to the other, well. And not to think about this strange thing of a strategy or planning and other stuff, because the market would have solved all the problem. So progressively, they have dismantled this capacity, which is not necessarily true in Asia, where still the planning ministry played an important role in the different governments, including in Japan and Korea. But in Africa, this was the case. On the other hand, if you attend the meeting of the African Union and many occasions to discuss, including the assembly of the African Development Bank, the major issue which is discussed now is what industrial strategy to change the productive structure of the country and create basis for development. So there is no clear-cut answer. There is an opportunity, and there are discussions about exploiting this opportunity. Let's say that for the moment, we can notice that China at present represents 17% of the African import, when it represented 5% of the import in 2000, and that if we take together India and Brazil, that in 2000 were around 4% of the trade relationship of China, we are now at the level of 10%. They have doubled. The story is not only trade, it's also foreign direct investment. On foreign direct investment, we have much less information, but still we observe that there is a strong increase of foreign direct investment that are realized by the emerging economy in Africa. And again, I take Africa as an example. My third point is about the organization of production. There is a new geography of production. Here I try to represent the first 20 manufacturer-producers of the world. And you see that in 2010, China shares of the total world manufacturing value added was 18.9%, let's say 19%, whilst the one of the United States was 18.2%. So in other terms, if you use value added, China is the first producer of the world already. And there are no doubt that China, Brazil, India, and Russia Federation, and also Indonesia, are among the top 20 world manufacturers producer in 2010. Altogether, they represent only 28% of the manufacturing production of the world, but their share is permanently increasing. So if we look at the factory of the world, there is no one factory. There is a multipolar organization where there are several actors, several factories, if you prefer, and there is no real reason to think that in perspective this number will be reduced and we will go back to this strange picture that sometimes you read on the newspaper. There are some experts that say, let's hope that all people in Asia will go together with China and the other will go together with the United States, and finally we will go back to a more ordered world. Nobody understands why a bipolar world, kind Cold War, would be better. Maybe for Manichaean perspective, people that like the good and the bad or something like this. But I don't think that there is no real serious reason to envisage a change in this type of equilibrium. What matters with this story of the reorganization of production is the new problems that appear to the developing countries due to this reorganization. Their production is taking the shape of internal clusters. They organize value chain within the country. In China, there are a lot of clusters or industrial districts or cadena productiva, or doesn't matter how do you want to call the fact that we are not speaking about one individual firms, but a cluster of firms that together produce a final product. This idea that firms are islands in a sea of market relationships, speaking only with signal of prices. Sometimes there are economists that are capable to do poetic economy like this, but this representation doesn't correspond to the reality. The firms produce in strong relationship of cooperation to each other. This is the case in our country. It is more and more the case also in the emerging country. And not only they are creating in cluster within the country, but they are organizing the process of production, moving part of the process of production around the world. And here it's very interesting the representation of 95 relationship in industrial production in Asia, where you see that the crucial poles were Japan and United States. And then you see 10 years later, unfortunately we don't have more updated data, it would be even stronger, you see that practically it's China, the point of reference. Now the problem for the Chinese firms is how do we organize a process of production with a piece that is done here and a piece that is decentralized? How do we choose what we do and what we buy? How do we create better cooperation relationship along the production chain? If you read the speech of the new leader of China, you will identify that there is a very interesting point about improving the relationship with the partner economic countries, which means in China there is a serious concerns about how to improve the quality of the relationship with the production that is done elsewhere. So these are some of the consequences that I wanted to highlight related with shifting wealth. But let's move to my third point. Is shifting wealth sustainable? There are some responses to some of the challenges that appears. Here I will highlight some point again, but I think they are particularly relevant. We've spoken about middle classes, and here you have a kind of representation of the middle classes in the globe. Maybe this is not that much readable. I can tell you what is the story. The story is that in China and in the emerging countries, the middle classes are the part that is growing over time. It starts with 2000, it will end in 2048, and you see that in particular India is the yellow, China is the brown, and other Asia is the cream. So you can easily see that the middle classes are there. Now, why this may be a concern for the development of shifting wealth? Let me go back to my German colleague that usually comes to my office, knock at the door and boast a little bit. He came to see me later, and he said, Mario, I have to ask you another quiz. And the quiz is the following. Where it is? Let me see. I got lost. Let me move a little bit because I think it's a very interesting exercise and I would like to do it with you. Just a second. Okay, this is the country. He said it's in North Africa. It's a country that is lower middle income. For 10 years, it has an average growth rate of 5%. For this year, the deficit of the states was 3%. The total debt of the states was 50%, 42.8, as you can see, of GDP. In other terms, this country was capable to have performances that no European country, including Germany, has been capable to reach. These are the Maastricht criteria, obviously, no? And this country is a good performer in terms of Maastricht criteria. Moreover, this country is a country that had very good enrollment, services, and the rest. So he went, which country is this? Obviously, I said, I don't know. And he said, it's Tunisia. This is Tunisia before the Arab Spring. Why the story is relevant? Because it's telling us that a country which is excellent in terms of economic growth was a disaster in terms of political and social condition, at the point that a conservative revolution took place, and we know the whole story. Why this was the case? How can we explain this phenomenon? Obviously, there are political explanations that says why this country went through a major upheaval. But look this indicator. It's very interesting. It's an indicator that put together performances in terms of economic growth, of education, and finally is an indicator of life satisfaction, which is a subjective indicator. We put them together, and you see that China was more or less in line. Good economic growth, good education, satisfaction growing. You see that India, so-and-so, Costa Rica, Brazil, they were all aligned. There are two countries that were not aligned. In other terms, economic growth translated into better education, at least in terms of coverage, but in terms of satisfaction, people were not satisfied. This is Tunisia and this is Thailand. Two countries in which there were major important upheaval. We may also, just for the sake of discussion, add a third country, and this third country is Chile, with the upheaval of students a few years ago and a certain mobilization that continue. And I'm sure that you will have other examples in developing countries to be added. How can we explain this phenomena? Well, this phenomena is very interesting because it tells us about the middle classes. When we say middle classes, at least me, the first time that I heard it, it came to my mind a visit that Khrushchev made in the United States where Nixon accompanied him to an exhibition where it was rebuilt the family house of a U.S. low, middle wage income family. And this was a house where there were presumably two parents, where there were two fridges, where there were two cars, where there were two children, and there were two dogs. Now, what are the middle classes we are talking about? The same? In reality, no. We are speaking of people that have left extreme poverty, very often thanks to Bolsa Familia, to Progressa, then they became Oportunidades, to many other programs that are similar. And now, who are they? They are people that 60% of the case do not have a car, not two, one. These are people that when they retire don't have a pension because they work in the informal economy in the majority of the cases. These are people that if there is somebody sick or die or a divorce in the family, fall back in extreme poverty. These are people that may have two parents, not always. I don't know, maybe two children. I don't know about the dogs. The point is that these are vulnerable people. In other terms, there is a strong expectation that comes from the fact that you have left extreme poverty, but there is no real answer from society about this expectation, or at least the risk to fail is very high. Let's go back to Tunisia. 40 years ago in North Africa, the rate of fertility was 7 children per woman. The children were the pension, as it was the case in my family in Italy. You come from poor family, I come from poor family. The children were the pension. I do children so that when I am old, they will take care of me, not the opposite. Now, the rate of fertility in North Africa is 2.1, lower than in France. The children become the aspiration of the family, the realization of the family. Instead of buying a Mercedes, you send your children to the university. And then if after the secondary school or university it doesn't find a job, what happened? It happened that it's a failure for the whole family. And in fact, in Tunisia, it does not find a job except in the informal economy. As such, the whole aspiration of family go burst. This type of phenomena create enormous tension that may produce strong reaction, including a social and political instability in those countries. In many cases, this is part of what is called the middle income trap. And there is no doubt that in China, there are serious concerns about this middle income trap. Now, why is the case? Why we are incapable to better create solidity in a developing economy is in respect of these classes. This is a graph that we presented many years ago about Latin America, but still is talkative. It represents the Gini indicator as a measure of inequalities before taxes and after taxes. What is particularly interesting is starting with the last representation on the right side of the graph. This is the OECD countries. And you see that the inequalities, before taxes is the square, are relatively high. In reality, they are comparable to the inequalities in Latin America. So many of these stories that says in Latin America people are unequal because it's cultural, it's Cristoforo Colombo that came, and so on. Well, we can believe it or not. I think that there is something else that can explain the phenomena. In fact, what happened after taxes and after the use of money of taxes in order to provide services to people, that inequality, the Gini indicator, fell down considerably. So taxes have a role in redistributing to people that are poor in respect to those that are rich. What happened in many developing countries, and in particular here in Latin America? As you can see, the difference before and after taxes is practically none. Why is so? At least there are two explanations. The first explanation is that taxes are extremely poor. Guatemala has 13% of taxes out of GDP. The fiscal revenue of Colombia is 14%. Mexico, without the oil contribution, is 11.3%. Now there are reforms that Peña Nieto wants to do and change this mechanism and system. Generally speaking, what is the level of OECD country in terms of taxes? Well, it's 35%. It's not 13%. How can you do redistributive policies, service policies, modify the inequalities in the countries? It's Cristoforo Colombo and the discovery of America. It's policies. But in order to do policies, you need to have the finance. Now, obviously, there is a kind of very suspect argument here that says, but look, the economic crisis of Europe comes from the social state. Wait a second. It will come, maybe, but at present it's not the case. The countries that more spend and more tax are those that less have crisis. As we all know, these are the Northern European countries. In reality, there is a very strong correlation between the level of taxes and the level of GDP per capita in the world. The richer a country is, the higher are the taxes. And there are only 3 exceptions that are still countries with very high level of taxes, but not linear. They are Australia, United States, and Japan. In a certain sense, they are 3 islands. Their exposure to the external economy is limited. The need for the state to take care of the consequences, in part also of trade, is lower. So, for all these reasons, the level of inequalities in those countries is particularly high. I quoted Latin America because it's the country with the highest level of inequalities. In Southeast Asia, it's lower. In Africa, in a certain sense, is lower as well. So, as a consequence, here we have a first challenge. And the challenge is, if the government are not doing anything in this respect, then there could be some consequences. Here we have represented the level of conflict in China over time. And you see what is the picture. Conflict in China are increasing. Wages are also increasing. And one of the major reasons why there is a change in the economic policy of China is also taking into account those tensions that appear in the economy and in the society. But when we hear the so-called middle-income trap, in reality, we are not only thinking in terms of social phenomena. We are also thinking in terms of productivity. In many developing countries, productivity remains low. Typically, is the case of Latin America. Despite Latin America starting with a GDP per capita higher than South Korea now is a rich country. South Korea has level of productivity extremely high. Their level of productivity before was lower than in Latin America. Latin America didn't move. Why is so? Where is the explanation of the fact that we have other limits that are in the productive structure of this society? Here we have an interesting graph. It tries to represent the investment in research and development in general, which is on the vertical axis, and done by the private sector in the horizontal axis. Now, what can we observe? Despite all the dynamism, we are speaking of 3% of growth for Latin America this year, 5.1% of Sub-Saharan Africa this year and 5.4% in Southeast Asia. So despite a clear dynamism in this economy, where do we stand in terms of innovation? This indicator is very bad. Innovation is in reality the result of many things, not only on I+D+I investment. No? Nevertheless, this indicator somehow, when we look at it in aggregate terms, is helpful. And there is no doubt, developing countries do not invest in research, in particular the private sector. Also the public, but in particular the private sector. Now, what is the consequence of this situation? Why this could be a threat? Well, it could be a threat in several senses. But the first point that I would like to make is that, let me just give some data. In the OECD country, the investment in I+D+I is 2.3% of GDP. In China, is 1.5%. There are certain regions that are extremely high in terms of investment, but in average it's 1.5. In Brazil, in Russia Federation, in India, the investment is less than 1%. In Latin America, we are 0.8 in general. Now, why is so? Well, this indicator, it tells us a little bit more than the pure interest in investing in innovation. It tells also something about the economic structure of this country. In many cases, the developing countries are countries that produce raw materials. They were capable, thanks to this specialization, to deal quickly with the crisis of 2008. In Latin America, there is no doubt that through fiscal rules and better management of macroeconomic policy, there was a knowledge that 10 years before didn't exist. Secondly, there was a certain internal demand, the famous middle classes. And third, there was a diversification in the trade relationship, in particular with China. As a consequence, Latin America was pegada by the crisis, but was capable to recuperate relatively quickly. Yes, that's very interesting. At the same time, anyhow, Latin America was creating its relationship with China mainly through the export of raw material. What's the problem in this case? Those countries are affected by the so-called Dutch disease, which is something that happened in Netherlands, but not only in Netherlands. And we know what is the story. You export raw materials. As a consequence, your rate of exchange increases. The competitive raw material activities and employment are capable to grow and increase wages. The services that are protected at home are capable to increase wages. In other terms, those that deliver to the engineers of the mines pizzas raise the price. But the manufacturing activity in the country are incapable to survive with that level of rate of exchange and with that level of average wages. And therefore, they fail. In this society, you have an increasing inequality that is coming from the specific specialization in production. And as a consequence, the quality of growth matters for the social condition of the country. But the second case is the producer of subcontractor, let's say, in the global value chain. Let me continue with Latin America because we have several cultural affinity between. In Latin America, Costa Rica is a country that benefited a lot from an investment of Intel that took place some decades ago. And thanks to this, Costa Rica was capable to take off. Moreover, Costa Rica is a country that doesn't have an army and invests 8% of GDP in education. And obviously was capable to attract this investment thanks also to those conditions at the origin. But now President Chinchilla is saying, wait a second, due to shifting wealth, now there are 83 countries that are growing. Many are on the market saying, come here, invest in my country. And now the competition I'm facing to keep my position is growing. What should I do in order to make better attractiveness in my country? President Chinchilla is obviously considering that in China, the famous technological capability somehow that existed in China is growing. In the past, the problem was to being quicker in innovating than China in copying. But now the problem is a different one. Let me give you another data. Every year in OECD, we do an exercise that is called PISA. We measure the capacity of 15 years old girls and boys to read, to understand the text, to make calculation, and to write. Traditionally, there were 3 countries at the top of this ranking. Singapore, Finland, South Korea. Once second, first, there was, but the picture on the podium was always the same. For the first time, 2 years ago, we made the same exercise in 2 provinces in China. Obviously, they are the most developed, there is Shanghai and so on. But we are speaking of 300 million people. Okay, it's a province, but 300 million people. Now, what was the ranking of China measured for the first time? China was the first. In other terms, we are speaking of a situation that is quickly evolving. Chinchilla is understandable. She's saying, if I want to attract investment, I have to compete with China, with those people with skills that are very good indeed. And it's not only China. It's Vietnam, it's Thailand, it's Malaysia, and so on. What should I do? We did another exercise in OECD. We start measuring trade in terms of value added instead of product. When a product comes in and then goes out, you calculate the total value of the product. You do not calculate what is the value added that was done in the country. So trade is a little bit alterated because of this calculation. We are trying now to measure just the value added. What do we observe? We observed that Mexico, that was capable to attract foreign direct investment with NAFTA in the frontier, the very center of the country, moved from Mexico City to the northern Monterrey, Tijuana, and the rest of the province, Chihuahua in particular, and so on. Well, the value added of Mexico is reducing over time. In other terms, you are capable maybe to attract foreign direct investment, but you are not necessarily capable to capitalize on those foreign direct investment in order to grow faster. In both cases, producer of raw material and producer of subcontracting phase in the process of production internationally organized have challenges. The point for them is how do they strengthen their competitiveness, or even how do they create their competitiveness? As you cannot export for all your life banana and think that you will become a growing country. You need to diversify the production. Second point, characteristic of this country is that the diversification of raw material, even when they produce raw material, is very limited. If you take developing countries, I don't have the graph here, but you will easily realize that many developed countries produce raw material, and a lot. The point is that they produce many different types of raw material, many different phases, and they do not do only raw material. That's the difference. Again, these countries are very specialized in a narrow part of the production of the production process of a narrow industry, which is raw material. And this explains why investment in IMAS-DEMAS is very limited. Third thing is strategies. In this country, strategies of industrialization have been lacking. For many years, it was our fault. World Bank, IMF, EIDB, Inter-American Development Bank were going in the country and saying, the best industrial policy is no industrial policy. Don't think to intervene on your economy. The best is that you do it for business, just reducing time to open firms, just do administrative simplification, just regulatory reform, but never enter in the economy. Now it's clear that the United States, President Obama, is declaring how important it is to intervene in the economy. China is doing it. The United Kingdom proposed the creation of a development bank, France the same, and so on. So the picture is changing because there is an issue, how to strengthen our economy. And related to it, but I have lost all the graph because I play with them. Okay, now, related to it, there is a problem of skills. And the problem of skills, if I'm capable to show it to you, is that it's easy to see when you ask entrepreneurs what is the most important component of their production capacity, which is lacking in Latin America and in Africa, the answer is skills. Now, what does it mean? It means that the school in Africa in Latin America is inappropriate for the firms, that the school should better serve the labor market. That's only part of the story. It's true that in many cases, student goes to university faculties that are not necessarily producing people for the labor market. But in fact, in society, sometimes we need also philosophers. Now, the point is another one. It's the story that I told you about Tunisia. The problem of Tunisia was not that the people were not trained. Maybe they were badly trained. The problem was that there was no demand in the labor market, the modern labor market, for young people. And the reason was that the economy was dominated by monopolies, in that case controlled by the Ben Ali family, but in other developing countries, the privatization gives place to the control of the economy from few monopolies or oligopolies, and the modern sector of those economies is limited. Why it happened that way? Because we promoted privatization, but we didn't promote it at the same time competitive laws. Competition in those countries remained extremely weak. I don't know if you have in mind some example. It comes one to my mind about telecommunication in one Latin American country that is owned by the richest man in the world, so I think it's not difficult to identify an example of that nature. That's the story. The problem of skills is how do we create skills, but also how do we create a demand for those skills that is not necessarily always existing. And I will not speak about the credit of SMEs, because we are in the house of Santander. I heard the politician already addressing the matter. I know that you know all banking very well. You know better than I do that there is a systematic failure in the market for credit in respect of SMEs. We heard about it. If this is true in developed countries, it's even more true in developing countries where, moreover, very often small and medium-sized firms are in the informal sector. Let me insist rather on another point, and this point is about infrastructure. The competitiveness of firms, as we said, is not done just inside the black box, the way in which you put the machine and the way in which you hire good skilled labor. The competitiveness of the firms is done by the whole relationship that the firms undertake with subcontractors. I am particularly ignorant in many things, in engineering in particular, and I bought, to listen music, good plant. I actually bought very good boxes and a bad amplifier. The sound that I listen is determined by the bad component, the amplifier. If you produce a product and one of your subcontractors is bad, probably the quality of the product will be determined by the lower quality of your cooperator. In other terms, your competitiveness depends also from the other. The same thing applies to infrastructure. The same firms with the same machine, the same worker in the Sahara Desert or in EB producing toys probably has different productivity. This is related to the fact that in EB there is a center for toys, that in EB there are certain infrastructure, that in EB there is a school, a technological school, which is in Alcoy, that is not that far, and so on. In other terms, infrastructure matters. The place where you are is a component of your competitiveness. Now, in many cases, infrastructure in developing countries are of bad quality. First is the negotiation. In Colombia, the price we calculated is fact that I told President Santos, so this is an official information. The price that is negotiated with firms is multiplied 3 times at the end of the work, which means that obviously information are not working well, and therefore the market for infrastructure do not work well. Secondly, we speak about private-public partnership, but very often the public sector doesn't know exactly what to ask to the private sector, and again, the agreement don't work that well. I am not speaking about the planning system about infrastructure, with the exception of Chile in Latin America. Very few countries have developed a serious analysis of what are the priority infrastructure that are required in this continent. Okay, these were a series of examples where I wanted to set challenges. Now, let me very quickly say that something is happening in developing countries. It's a challenge. This mechanism can represent sand in the engine. They could stop the machine from going. But still, some reactions are there. In particular, what we observe is that more and more countries are thinking in terms of industrial policies. And they are asking themselves an interesting question. For example, they are asking, how should we intervene? Only at the national level, or should we engage regions in industrial policy? It would be interesting to have the point of view of the consejera in this respect. Brazil, China are more thinking about decentralizing the measures. South Africa, Chile are very conservative, despite the fact that Chile has created a regional agency for industrialization. They are thinking about the priority. Should the industrial policy have as a target only the competitiveness of firms? How do we deal with social cohesion and the informal economy? The objective, should we diversify the economy or strengthen our so-called comparative advantages and invest on those? On the comparative advantages, we need to be a little bit clear, because sometimes on the comparative advantages there are strange ideas. We think in terms of absolute advantages more in terms than relative advantages. I think that nobody would have thought, if you know Finnish people that are very shy, that they don't like to talk to each other, that they would have invented Nokia, an instrument to talk as much as you can, including when you are close to the other. Nor in Italy, where French use all our forests, you would have thought that we would have developed a furniture industry. So the comparative advantages are a strange animal that should be considered seriously. But finally, the point is also the policy mix. How do we strengthen the competitive capacity in the developing country? Only by doing industrial policy for firms, or is it rather a strategy that entails at the same time skills, research, labor market policy, so a combined series of policy? I was deputy director, it was recalled by Danielle very kindly, in my career of a director called public governance. And I don't know why, but at a certain point in time, in the OECD country, we thought that the best policy you can do is not to think to what your colleagues are doing. Concentrating yourself only in your policy area and then do as much as you can only in your policy area. There was only one ministry that was thinking in general terms, was the Ministry of Finance, that was trying to cut in all the area. Now the things is changing. With the crisis, with the need to create packages to relaunch demand, at least in 2009, well, the problem was how do we create stimulus? And immediately came the idea that you cannot operate only in sector because the problem of the people and of your country are not in one sector, in one area of policy. This is a classical input-oriented bureaucratic behavior. It's not starting from the problem that exists. You call the engineers for water, for electricity, for telecommunication, and they don't talk to each other. Therefore, here there is also a question, how do we operate in terms of policy or in terms of strategy? Now, in order to conclude, because being Italian, my mother obliged me to speak a lot, as much as I can, but I have already accomplished with the mandate of my mother, I can get closer to the conclusion and say, okay, fine. We have seen that there is a change in the globe. We have seen that this change of the globe is deemed to continue. It has some consequences. It changes the social structure. It changes the organization of production. It changes many things in the world. Still, it's not sure that this is necessarily forever sustainable. There are bottlenecks, and these bottlenecks concern different things. Exactly, social unsatisfaction, incapacity to improve productivity, education, the way in which we do it, and so on. Now, there could be some policies, in certain cases countries are doing it. I am not suggesting that they do. I am simply recording, taking notes of the fact that Brazil with BNDES, that South Africa with their efforts about converting the mine economy, that India and China in particular are doing strong industrial policy more and more. And then now Colombia, with the regalias of mines, wants to use 50% of the regalia for an anti-cyclical fund, 10% to do innovation, and 40% to do regional infrastructure. So many countries are thinking how we can intervene there. But if this is a trend, I'm not saying that it should be that way or not, I'm simply noting that it's that way. The point that could be interesting is to say, okay, but what can we learn from the past and avoid some mistakes that in the past have been made? In industrial policy, as well as in other things, in macroeconomic policy, maybe we have also done some mistakes. I don't know if we are in the crisis in which we are. Maybe something went wrong. So, I think that there are some points that are worthwhile to be mentioned. And let me just show a long list just to create panic. I will not go through all these points, but just some. What did not work in the past was indiscriminated subsidies. The idea was very simple. If you have an economy that is not working, one of the regions, in the case of Spain, could be the south or some other regions, then let's give subsidies to these firms so that the investment will be compensated for the loss of going there. And by this compensation, we close the inequalities and we recreate level playing field for the investments and the investors. This type of policy didn't work. To avoid diplomatic mistakes, it didn't work, first of all, in my country, where small entrepreneurs of the South receiving money, the majority of the time didn't know what to do with it, and at the most bought again, he or she, the same machine that were already there. Either you have economy of scale, or the fact that you buy and you extend your production process doesn't necessarily increase productivity. And in many cases, in those sectors, there were no big economy of scale. Therefore, this type of mechanism often creates an attitude of assistance and is not that productive. A second similar point is the never-ending support. I do a policy, but I don't put any sunset clause. It will continue forever. The idea here is very often small and medium-sized firms are handicapped firms. The large firms are the real firms. The small firms, we like them very much under the condition that they change. And they become another things. Imagine if you say so to your lover or a boyfriend or girlfriend. It's a little bit strange. I love you under the condition you change. Small firms, in reality, the majority of the time, are not handicapped. The problem of small firms is not their size, it's their isolation. If they work with other small firms, they are like large firms without the roof. They can compete as a large firm in many sectors, not in all, but in many sectors. So the point is not the never-ending support towards an handicapped, just to maintain in life the handicapped firm. The point is to do an appropriate firms for those firms. The problem is that we have done policy for small firms that were the same policy for large firms with less money, but the same scheme. We have provided experts that were experts in organization of large firms, and then we're saying to an entrepreneur with 4 employees, you should have a marketing department, a production department, and what else? 4 employees. But now these 4 employees were capable to export and be very competitive. A third thing that didn't work was what we call in Italy the cathedral in the desert. Big important investment in a region without thinking about the real comparative advantages, the real asset in that region. And why this was the case? Because the central bureaucrat, the capital, simply doesn't know what are the real conditions in the region, what are the real advantages. Very often in the region, either people knows all the story. They don't know what is happening in very far market and in very condition. What is required is both, and to have the different actors around the table. But this scheme were not put in place. The only decision was the elaboration by an economist that doesn't touch the reality of what are the priorities on the basis of very generic calculation. Fourth, I have already mentioned, competition. We have always supported firms. We have not thought about competition policy. Very often because our policy have been captured by the big group. And as a consequence, the list that we have to put in place were competition policy and antitrust policies. This is extremely required. Very often there is a strong discussion in developing countries about protectionism or not. If you remove the ideological dimension, what is behind is, should we have competition or not? You can have a country which is close, but with very high level of competition. It was the case of Korea. Once they opened the border, thanks to the competition that was organized in the country was capable to compete. The point is not the openness or not, it's the level of competition. There is, in other terms, very often a capture by the incumbents. What is very interesting is that when you speak about industrial policy or other policy, the traditional orthodox view is to say, be careful, if you do those policies, then you will be captured. The point is the opposite. We are already captured. How do we intervene in order to remove the capture? That's the issue. And finally, just not to bother you, is the short-term horizon of this policy. Very often, we made a mistake in the past thinking that big investments were required. In reality, what is required is a clear framework and a long-term, repeated and sure intervention. In other terms, clarify what the government intends to do. Now, we observe tendency in this direction. Is one of the area of policy, together with the area of policy on social. Within this policy are indispensable. Therefore, my long story boils down in very few words. We are in a shifting wealth world. There could be some problems that will appear. This problem can be faced with appropriate policy. They are not necessarily the same policy we have put in place in OECD countries. The innovation in policy doesn't come only in one direction. You have innovation in policies that are now done in the South that we should import. I think that there is no doubt that we can learn a lot from Roberto Lavagna and the way in which he dealt with the crisis in Argentina. But as much as I know, he's consulted by private firms in Europe, he's not consulted by government. I think we can learn a lot from the fiscal council that many developing countries are putting in place and the fiscal rules that they are putting in place. We have for sure learned from the conditional cash transfer measure to fight against poverty, invented in Mexico, in Brazil, and Bangladesh, are now applied in 83 countries, and the last that applied this scheme is the municipality of New York. What is true in this shifting wealth world is that now there are many more actors, many more innovation, and paradoxically, there is a stronger need to sit down and to talk to each other. And at the end, I have a joke to finish the story. And this is a joke of an economist, Albert Hirschman, that unfortunately died last year, one of the most important, under my point of view, development economists. And he wrote a beautiful article in the 80s about the obstacle to the perception of change. And he says, the world is changing, but very often we do not want to see it. And he told a story. And he said about two people meeting each other. And one says to the other, Paul, what's happening to you? It has been 10 years. We didn't see each other. But you were tall, now you are small. You were fat, and now you are thin. And the other goes, sorry, gentlemen, but my name is not Paul. You have changed so much, even the name. Let's recognize the new names. Thank you.